The year was one of uncertainty and fire. The nation, young, restless, and divided, was locked in the grip of war. Across the countryside, farm fields had been trampled into mud by marching boots, and towns once bustling with markets and children's laughter now echoed with the steady drumbeat of soldiers and the distant thunder of cannons. Smoke rose often on the horizon, a grim reminder that no corner of the land was truly untouched by the conflict. Every man was expected to fight. Farmers put aside their plows, blacksmiths their hammers, and merchants their wares to take up muskets in defense of the flag. In villages and towns alike, families bid farewell to fathers, brothers, and sons, uncertain if they would ever return. War was no longer something spoken of in whispers. It was a reality that carved itself into every street, every home, every soul. And yet, in the midst of this turmoil, a figure walked against expectation. Among the weary recruits marching toward the battlefield that summer morning was a woman, her step steady, her resolve sharper than steel. Her name was Eliza Ward, though to most of the regiment she was simply the girl with the rifle. At first glance, she looked out of place among the ranks of grim-faced men. Her frame was lean, her dark hair tucked beneath a tattered cap, and her uniform pieced together from cast-offs hung loosely around her. But what she lacked in bulk, she carried in something more dangerous: conviction. She had not come to follow, nor to be shielded. She had come to fight. The men around her whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. "She won't last a day out there," one said, spitting into the dirt. "She run at the first shot," another muttered. "Or get herself killed and drag the rest of us down," a third added grimly. But Eliza kept walking, her hands gripping her rifle as if it were the only anchor holding her to the earth. She did not flinch at their words. She had heard worse before, and she had something they did not, an unshakable fire that came not from glory-seeking, but from loss. Her brother, Thomas, had been among the first to volunteer when war broke out. He was strong, confident, and brimming with the kind of charm that made men follow him without question. Eliza had watched him march away one crisp autumn morning, his musket slung across his back, promising he would return a hero. He never came home. Months later, news reached her that he had fallen in battle, struck down in a skirmish that barely made the reports. To the world, his death was a statistic. To Eliza, it was a wound that never closed. That was the day she decided she would not stay behind. If the nation demanded sacrifice, she would give her own. If the war was to steal sons and brothers, then it would also reckon with the fury of a sister. Still, it had not been easy convincing the regiment to accept her. Commanders scoffed, officers rolled their eyes, and fellow recruits chuckled openly. Women, they insisted, were healers, seamstresses, and caretakers, not fighters. But Eliza had shown them her aim. With her father's old musket, she split an apple clean in half from 50 yards away. She reloaded with hands steady as stone, while the men fumbled through powder and ball. Skill spoke louder than prejudice, and though the commanders grumbled, they could not deny she was valuable. Reluctantly, they allowed her to join. Now, as the sun burned its way across the sky, and the air filled with the rank smell of sweat and powder, Eliza marched with the others toward the battlefield. Her heart pounded not with fear, but anticipation. She had waited for this moment, not for bloodshed, but for proof. Proof that courage was not limited by gender. Proof that her brother's sacrifice had not been in vain. Proof that even one soldier, underestimated and overlooked, could make a difference. The road they followed wound through scorched fields, where blackened stalks of corn stood like skeletal sentinels. Houses along the way were abandoned, their windows shattered, doors broken, roofs caved in from cannon fire. Dogs barked in the distance, but no families came to the doorsteps. War had emptied the land of its laughter. By the time the regiment reached the ridge overlooking the valley, they could already hear the crack of muskets and the booming of artillery. The battle had begun. Smoke rose in thick columns from the tree line where the enemy had entrenched themselves. The ground below was littered with the broken fallen men, splintered wagons, and shattered equipment. The commander barked orders, his voice hoarse from shouting. The men readied their weapons, checked their powder horns, and adjusted their packs. Eliza stood among them, her rifle clutched tight. It was not the rifle she wanted. The weapon issued. To her was old, its stock worn, its barrel scarred by years of use. She knew its reputation. It jammed often, especially under the stress of battle. When it was handed to her, she caught the smirks of the others. "Fitting," one soldier muttered under his breath. "Give the broken gun to the girl." Eliza ignored him, though a flicker of unease gnawed at her. She inspected the weapon carefully, cleaning what she could, testing the trigger, adjusting. The flint. It wasn't perfect, but she had no choice. War didn't wait for better odds. Around her, the men knelt, murmuring prayers or kissing tokens from home. Eliza had no token to kiss. Instead, she whispered a vow to herself. This war took Thomas. It will not take me before I've left my mark. A trumpet blared. Orders rang out. The regiment moved forward, their boots pounding against the earth. Eliza's breath quickened. Her body tensed like a bowstring, every sense sharpened by the knowledge that in moments she would step into chaos. The valley yawned before them, filled with smoke and fire. The enemy waited beyond the tree line, muskets raised, bayonets glinting. Somewhere in that haze, a commander barked orders with precision, holding their line steady. Eliza tightened her grip on her rifle. Doubt flickered again. What if it jammed? What if, when she needed it most, it betrayed her? She pushed the thought aside. Weapons were tools. Courage was choice. And she had already made hers. When the first cannon roared, the ground shook beneath her feet. Men shouted, muskets fired, and the air was immediately thick with smoke and fear. Eliza stepped forward, her heart steady, her mind clear. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one truth. History had just opened its ledger, and she was determined to write her name inside, before she ever set foot on a battlefield, before the smoke of muskets burned her lungs and the cries of men rattled her ears. Eliza Ward had been a daughter, a sister, and a restless soul in a quiet town. She grew up in a modest farmhouse on the edge of a valley where the hills rolled like waves and the sky stretched endlessly above. Life there was simple days filled with the rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting. Her father was a stern but fair man, a veteran of a previous war who seldom spoke of his battles, but carried their scars in silence. Her mother, kind but practical, believed a woman's place was in the home, tending to children and hearth. And yet, from the beginning, Eliza had never been content with the narrow lanes of expectation carved out for her dot as a child. She had a curiosity that could not be bound. While other girls embroidered linens or learned the proper steps of a waltz, Eliza spent her time trailing her brother Thomas into the woods. He was older by 3 years, her closest confidant and protector, and it was he who first placed a musket in her hands. She remembered the day vividly. The sun had been low, spilling golden light through the branches, and Thomas had set up apples on a fence post, daring her to try. "Just close one eye," he said, guiding her small hands along the wooden stock. "Breathe steady. Don't think too much, just trust yourself." The musket had been heavy, the recoil startling, but when the apple split into 2 clean halves, Eliza's heart had soared. She felt something then that she had never felt in her sewing lessons, nor in the lectures. About proper manners, power. The knowledge that she could aim, decide, and strike it was intoxicating dot from that day forward. Whenever her chores were done, she begged Thomas to take her shooting. He obliged with patient smiles, though he often teased her when she bested his aim. By the time she was 15, she could load, prime, and fire faster than most men in town. By 16, she could hit a target from distances that left her father shaking his head in disbelief. But if Thomas was her partner in adventure, he was also her anchor in sorrow. When their mother died suddenly of illness, Eliza wept into his shoulder until there were no tears left. When their father grew distant, retreating into himself with memories of old battles, it was Thomas who filled the gap with laughter and warmth. He became more than a brother. He was her hero, and when war broke out, Eliza knew he would not stay behind. She remembered the morning he left as if it were etched into her bones. The air had been sharp with autumn chill, the leaves burning red and gold. He stood tall in his uniform, musket slung across his back, eyes bright with determination. "Don't worry, Liz," he said, ruffling her hair like he always did. "I'll be back before the leaves fall again." But the leaves fell, and winter came, and spring followed. And Thomas did not return. The news arrived one morning, folded in a creased letter, delivered by a soldier who could not meet her eyes. Thomas had fallen in battle, one among dozens that day, his name lost in a list that stretched too long for the page. Eliza read the words again and again, but they never felt real. How could her brother, the boy who taught her to shoot, who carried her on his shoulders, who promised to come back, be gone? Grief settled into her like frost. For weeks she wandered the farm in silence, staring at the empty chair at the table, the musket he had left behind, the boots tucked neatly by the door. Her father did not speak of it. He only sat longer at the table, eyes fixed on nothing, the weight of another war claiming yet another piece of him. But grief has a way of hardening into resolve. Eliza woke one morning with a decision carved into her heart. She would not let Thomas's sacrifice fade into silence. If war had taken him, then she would give herself to the same cause, not as a mourner, but as a fighter. It was an audacious thought, nearly unthinkable for a woman in her time. Women were expected to heal wounds, cook meals, and pray for them. Men on the battlefield, they were not meant to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. But Eliza had never accepted the boundaries drawn around her. When she first declared her intent, her father erupted. "You'll not set one foot on that battlefield." "Eliza Ward," he thundered, his hand slamming against the table. "I've already buried one child to this war. I will not bury another." But Eliza stood firm, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You taught Thomas to fight. He taught me. And now it's my turn." Her father looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the determination in her eyes, the same fire that had once lived in his own when he was young. He did not speak again. Convincing the regiment, however, was another battle. When she first appeared at their camp, muskets slung over her shoulder, the men laughed. Some thought it a joke, others an insult. "Go back home, girl," one sneered. "This isn't play acting." But Eliza had anticipated their scorn. She simply walked to the firing line, loaded her musket with steady hands, and hit the target dead center. Then she reloaded faster than the men beside her and hit it again and again. By the time she had fired 5 shots, each striking true, the laughter had faltered. Skill, she knew, was the only language soldiers respected, and she spoke it fluently. Still, acceptance did not come easily. She was given the worst tasks, the heaviest loads, the most grueling chores. When rations ran thin, her portion was smaller. When equipment was short, she received the poorest. It was their way of forcing her to quit, but she refused. Every blister, every ache, every night shivering under a threadbare blanket only steeled her resolve. What none of them saw was the way she carried her grief with her like a hidden weapon. When she aimed her musket, she thought of Thomas. When she marched for him. When she endured their ridicule, she heard his laughter urging her forward. By the time the regiment prepared for their first true battle, Eliza was no longer a curiosity. She was a soldier, though begrudgingly acknowledged. Some still doubted her, but others had begun to nod in respect when she passed. Yet even in those moments of quiet victory, she knew she was fighting more than just the enemy across the field. She was fighting centuries of belief, the weight of tradition, the chains of expectation. She was fighting for every woman told she could not, should not, must not. And so, when they placed the battered, unreliable rifle in her hands, she did not see it as insult alone. She saw it as a test, a challenge to prove that she was not defined by the weapon she carried, but by the strength of the hands that wielded it. She ran her fingers along the worn wood, feeling its scars. In its flaws, she saw herself dismissed, underestimated, doubted. But like her, it still had fight left in it. Eliza Ward was no longer simply the girl from the valley, the sister left behind. She was the woman behind the rifle. And though the road ahead would be bloodied and brutal, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was, meant to be. Night settled heavy upon the camp, the kind of darkness that seemed alive with whispers. The soldiers huddled around low fires, their faces half lit by flickering flames, their eyes shadowed with the knowledge of what awaited them. At dawn, the battle would come with the rising sun. Of that there was no question. Scouts had returned with word of the enemy, digging trenches and fortifying positions just beyond the valley. The morning would bring blood. Eliza Ward sat slightly apart from the others, her back against a rough-hewn log, her rifle across her knees. Around her, the men muttered in low voices, snatches of prayers, nervous laughter, bitter curses at fate. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if even the night itself held its breath. For many of them, this was not their first battle. They had seen comrades fall, seen the chaos of cannon fire, smelled the acrid stench of powder and death. But for Eliza, though she had trained and drilled until her body ached, tomorrow would be her true test. She ran her fingers along the stock of the weapon she had been issued earlier that day. It was an old rifle, its barrel dented, the wood chipped, the flint duller than it should be. She had immediately recognized the signs. It was unreliable. A gun that jammed at the worst possible moments. When the quartermaster shoved it into her hands, she had seen the smirk tugging at his lips. A subtle message. Let's see how long you last with this. Whispers had followed her as she walked away from the supply line. Fitting, she overheard one soldier say, "Give the girl the broken rifle. Saves a better one for the men." She ignored them, though the words burned. She had faced ridicule before. She had worn it like armor. Yet in the quiet of the night, when the firelight painted shadows across her face, she allowed herself to feel the weight of doubt. What if the rifle failed her in the heat of battle? What if, at the moment she needed it most, it betrayed her? She exhaled slowly, steadying her hands. Her father had once told her, "A weapon is only as strong as the hands that wield it." She clung to that thought, letting it drown the voices of doubt. Around the fire, the men played cards, chewed on stale bread, and traded stories to distract themselves from the morning ahead. A few glanced at her from time to time, their expressions unreadable. Some still looked at her with disdain, others with curiosity, and a few, though they would never say it aloud, with a flicker of respect. One soldier, a wiry man named Harris, finally spoke up. "You scared, Ward?" His tone carried mockery, but also a strange edge of genuine interest. Eliza looked at him steadily. "Only a fool walks into battle without fear," she replied. A few men chuckled. Harris smirked, but said no more. Inside, her stomach churned, but her face betrayed nothing. Fear was real, yes, but it was not weakness. Was proof that life still mattered. As the night deepened, silence fell heavier across the camp. The fires burned low, casting long shadows. Some men slept fitfully, jerking awake at every distant crack that echoed from the valley. Others simply stared into the flames, lost in private thoughts. Eliza did not sleep. She sat awake, her brother's memory keeping her company. She thought of Thomas's last morning, of the way he had smiled when he promised he would return. She wondered if he had felt this same nervous tension before his final battle, this same knot of dread and determination tangled together. The hours crawled until at last the horizon paled with the first light of dawn. A bugle sounded in the distance, shrill and cutting through the morning mist. The camp stirred to life at once. Men rose, some groaning, some silent, others already, muttering curses as they pulled on coats and checked their gear. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke from the dying fires. A chill clung to everything, seeping into bones and hearts alike. Eliza stood, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. She adjusted her pack, tightened the straps of her boots, and tied her hair back beneath her cap. Her hands were steady, though her heart thumped hard enough to echo in her ears. The commander's voice cut across the bustle. Orders barked sharp and clear. Form ranks, check powder, be ready to move. The men moved quickly, though their faces betrayed the fear they carried. Some crossed themselves, others kissed small tokens, a locket, a ring, a scrap of cloth from home. Eliza had no such token. She had only Thomas's memory and the rifle that felt like both a burden and a promise. She checked the flint again, tapped the barrel, loaded powder and ball with practiced motions. Her father's lessons returned to her in flashes steady hands. Calm breath, never rush. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "This war took Thomas. It will not take me before I've left my mark." The regiment began its march toward the valley. Boots thudded in unison against the frozen earth, the sound strangely rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Ahead, the sky had turned a dull gray, heavy with clouds, as if nature itself mourned what was to come. As they crested the ridge, the battlefield revealed itself in grim detail. Smoke already drifted upward in lazy spirals. The enemy had entrenched themselves at the tree line, their positions fortified, bayonets glinting even from a distance. The sound of cannon fire rumbled faintly, like distant thunder. The men shifted nervously, gripping their weapons tighter. Eliza's eyes swept across the valley, settling on the enemy lines. Somewhere in that haze, a commander's voice barked orders with crisp authority. She could almost see him, a shadowy figure directing the storm. Her pulse quickened. The battle was inevitable. The storm was about to break. The commander of her regiment raised his sword, his voice booming over the ranks. "Steady, men. Today we fight for honor, for country, for those who've fallen." Eliza lifted her rifle. It was old, battered, flawed, but so was she, in the eyes of many. Yet she would fight, not in spite of its imperfections, but because of them. The rifle would not define her. Her resolve would. Around her, the regiment shifted into formation. Muskets leveled, bayonets fixed, breaths held in anticipation. The air was still for a heartbeat, as if the world itself paused. Eliza felt her chest tighten, her mind sharpen. She was not a girl from a quiet farm. She was not just Thomas's sister. She was a soldier, standing at the edge of history. Then the first cannon boomed, shattering the silence. Smoke burst into the sky. The ground quaked beneath their feet. And the valley erupted in fire. The storm had come. And Eliza Ward marched into it, her heart steady, her hands firm on the rifle that the world believed would fail her. the valley roared with thunder. The first cannonball screamed overhead, tearing through branches before exploding in the earth behind the regiment. Dirt and stone showered the air. Men ducked instinctively, and the rhythm of boots faltered. Then came another blast, and another each, one shaking the ground as if the earth itself raged against them. The battle had begun in full. Forward! The commander bellowed, raising his sword. His voice fought against the noise, straining to be heard over the relentless boom of artillery. Hold your line. Forward! Eliza's chest tightened as she stepped in unison with the others, her heart pounding like a drum. Smoke already hung heavy in the air, acrid and choking. The acrid stench of black powder stung her nose, and her ears rang with the sharp cracks of musket fire from the enemy lines ahead. The regiment surged down the slope, rifles raised. Men shouted battle cries raw, guttural sounds that came not from courage, but from desperation. The enemy waited at the tree line, their bayonets catching what little sunlight pierced the clouds. A volley of musket fire erupted from their ranks, and men fell. Some crumpled silently, others screamed as they clutched at torn limbs. The ground became littered with the first casualties before Eliza even had time to aim. Her breath hitched. She had expected fear, expected death, but nothing could have prepared her for the chaos that surrounded her. The world became a blur of smoke, shouts, and the constant thunder of muskets and cannons. Yet, amidst it all, she found her training taking over. Her hands moved almost without thought. She pulled her rifle close, poured powder, set ball, rammed it down, checked the flint, cocked the hammer, just as Thomas had taught her years ago. She raised the weapon, sighted through the smoke, and fired. The kick slammed against her shoulder, familiar and grounding. She couldn't see if her shot had struck true, but the act itself steadied her. This was what she came for. This was the moment she had carried across fields and camps, through ridicule and doubt. Around her, the men reloaded, some fumbling. In panic, others cursing as their powder spilled. The enemy fired another volley, and more of her comrades fell. One man beside her dropped without a sound, his body collapsing into the mud, eyes staring blankly upward. Eliza forced herself not to look, not to falter. There would be time for grief later, if there was a later. She loaded again, her movements quick, efficient. She fired, then reloaded. Fired again. Smoke burned her eyes, sweat trickled down her brow, but she pressed forward with the line. Every shot was a promise to Thomas, a defiance to every man who had doubted her. And then it happened. As she rammed down the next ball, the rifle jammed. The rod stuck halfway, refusing to budge. She yanked, twisted, cursed under her breath, but it wouldn't move. Panic fluttered in her chest. She tried, again nothing. The flint sparked uselessly. The mechanism stuck. Around her, the line pressed forward, muskets flashing in bursts of fire and light. Men shouted for her to move, to keep pace. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, the useless rifle heavy in her hands. Not now. Please, not now. The enemy advanced. From their trenches, bayonets fixed, faces fierce behind the smoke. They came in a wave, shouting as they charged. Eliza's regiment met them with another volley, but the enemy pushed closer, steel flashing in the chaos. The clash was seconds away. Eliza gripped her jammed rifle tighter. She could drop it, scramble for another weapon, hide behind the line. That was what the men around her expected. A broken gun meant the end of her usefulness. But Eliza Ward had never lived by the expectations of others. She adjusted her grip, hefting the rifle like a club. If it would not fire, it would still strike. She refused to falter, refused to retreat. The lines collided. The sound was deafening, steel against steel, men screaming, the sickening thud of bodies colliding. Bayonets thrust, Sabers slashed, fists swung when weapons broke or failed. Eliza ducked beneath a blade, swinging the heavy butt of her rifle into the attacker's side. The man crumpled with a grunt, gasping for air. She pivoted, swinging again, the wood cracking against another soldier's jaw. The rifle wasn't firing, but it was far from useless. Her muscles burned, her lungs heaved, but adrenaline carried her forward. She fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing to prove except everything. Around her, men fell and rose, the battle shifting like a storm tide. At one point, she stumbled, nearly losing her footing on the slick mud. An enemy soldier lunged at her, bayonet aimed for her chest. She twisted, raising her rifle across her body. The blade scraped along the wood, missing her by inches. She shoved forward, slamming the butt of the weapon into his stomach, then drove her shoulder into him until he fell backward into the melee. Her arms ached from the weight of the weapon, from the force of each strike, but her mind was sharp, focused. She was no longer the out-of-place woman mocked by her regiment. In this chaos, she was a fighter, ruthless, unyielding. Yet even as she battled, she felt the creeping edge of despair. The enemy pressed hard, their commander's voice cutting through the smoke, rallying them with precise, confident orders. She could hear him shouting, directing the flow of the fight, keeping their line intact even as the regiment faltered. His presence was like a steel spine running through their army. Her own commander shouted as well, but his voice was hoarse, nearly drowned in the storm. For every foot they gained, the enemy forced them back too. For every man they struck down, another rose. Eliza clenched her teeth. If they couldn't break the enemy's spirit, if they couldn't shake their unity, this battle would end in slaughter. And at the center of that unity, she realized, was the enemy commander. She could see him through the haze, now a tall figure. On horseback near the tree line, his sword flashing as he gestured, his voice carrying above the din. Soldiers looked to him, drew strength from him, fought harder at his command. Her chest tightened. That man was the anchor, and anchors had to be cut loose. She shifted her grip on the rifle, ignoring the ache in her arms. Around her, men fought and died, the battle raging like wildfire. She could barely hear her own thoughts above the noise, but one truth rose above the chaos. If she could reach that commander, if she could take him down, the enemy's line might finally break. The rifle in her hands was jammed, battered, flawed. But so was she, and like her, it was still capable of something extraordinary. With a deep breath, Eliza pushed forward, carving a path through the melee. She ducked, swung, shoved, fought with a ferocity that stunned even those beside her. Each strike brought her closer, step by step, toward the figure who commanded the storm. The battle roared on around her, a tempest of smoke, blood, and fury. But Eliza Ward moved through it with unshakable resolve. Her broken rifle clutched like a weapon of destiny. She did not know if she would survive the next hour. She did not know if her body would endure the weight of the fight. But she knew this. She had not come this far to be silenced by a jammed gun. The storm had swallowed her whole. And still, she pressed forward. The battlefield stretched before her like a living nightmare, smoke curling through the trees, bodies strewn across the churned mud, the air thick with powder and cries of pain. Eliza pressed forward, driven not by orders, but by something primal and unshakable inside her. She had seen him, the man who held this storm together. The enemy commander towered above the chaos on horseback, his presence a beacon for his soldiers. Every command he shouted gave them renewed fury. Every gesture steadied their faltering line. If he fell, the tide would shift. Eliza gritted her teeth, clutching her jammed rifle like a club. The wood was cracked from earlier blows, its barrel dented where it had deflected a bayonet. Her arms burned, Her lungs heaved, yet her focus narrowed to that single figure. The commander wasn't just another officer. He was the spine of this fight, and she meant to break it. The clash of soldiers swelled around her as she pressed forward. She ducked beneath a swing, shoving her shoulder into a soldier's chest, knocking him back into the line of bayonets behind him. Another lunged at her, eyes wild, blade raised high. She twisted sideways, swinging the rifle in a brutal arc that cracked against his skull. He dropped like a felled tree, his helmet rolling away in the mud. Every step forward was a battle of its own. She shoved through bodies, dodged blades, struck with desperation. Her mind screamed to turn back, to fall in with the line where there was safety in numbers, but her heart was louder. She remembered Thomas, his lessons about leadership. Take out the head, and the body stumbles. His words rang now, truer than ever. She would not fail him. At last, the surge of men parted just enough for her to glimpse the commander again. He sat tall in his saddle, his posture straight, sword gleaming as he cut through the smoky air. He barked orders, his voice carrying with a confidence that infected those around him. Soldiers glanced up at him like frightened men glancing at a lighthouse during a storm. Eliza's pulse quickened. He was close, now closer than she thought possible. But between them still surged dozens of enemy soldiers. Reaching him would require more than strength. It would require speed, cunning, and luck. She wiped sweat from her brow with her sleeve, steeling herself. Then she surged forward, ducking into the smoke, using its veil to mask her movement. She weaved between soldiers, slipping past where their eyes were fixed on the regiment's line. Her smaller frame, once mocked, became an advantage. She darted low, unseen by many, until she emerged near the outer edge of the fray. The commander loomed ahead. He saw her now. Their eyes met through the haze. His gaze sharpened, narrowing in recognition. Not recognition of who she was, but recognition of her intent. She wasn't another soldier lost in the storm. She was coming for him. His lips curled into something between amusement and disdain. He spurred his horse forward slightly, sword flashing as he pointed it toward her. "Take her down," he shouted, his accent cutting through the chaos. Two soldiers peeled from his side, charging straight at her. Eliza braced herself. The first lunged with a bayonet. She sidestepped, her reflexes honed by raw desperation. As he stumbled past, she swung the chew, butt of her rifle upward, slamming it into his jaw. He crumpled, blood spraying from his mouth. The second was faster. His blade slashed across her arm, drawing a sharp cry as pain seared through her flesh. She stumbled back, clutching the wound, but didn't let go of her weapon. With a guttural roar, she swung low, cracking the soldier's knees. He buckled, and she brought the rifle down across his temple. Both men fell. She stood heaving, blood dripping from her arm. Mud splattered across her uniform. The commander's expression shifted. He wasn't amused anymore. He spurred his horse forward, breaking from his guard, sword raised high. Eliza's heart pounded. She had never faced a man on horseback before, and every instinct screamed that she was hopelessly outmatched. His blade glinted in the sun, sharp and merciless. She had only her broken rifle, a crude club against steel. But retreat wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. As the horse thundered closer, she dove sideways, rolling through the mud just as the commander's sword slashed down where she had stood. She scrambled to her feet, pivoting to face him. He wheeled the horse around, sneering down at her. "Foolish," he spat, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Do you think you can stop me with that?" He gestured toward her battered rifle. Eliza said nothing. Words would only waste breath. The commander charged again. His horse reared, hooves lashing dangerously close. Eliza ducked, swinging the rifle upward with every ounce of strength she had. The butt slammed against the horse's flank, startling the animal. It whinnied, jerking sideways, nearly unseating its rider. The commander cursed, pulling hard on the reins to steady the beast. That single opening was all she needed. She rushed forward, leaping onto the stirrup before he could react. With a roar, she swung her rifle upward, cracking it against his armored chest. The blow wasn't enough to kill, but it stunned him, knocked the wind from his lungs. The horse balked. Both rider and challenger tumbled into the mud. They scrambled to their feet almost simultaneously. The commander's face was twisted in rage, his sword flashing as he swung. Eliza barely dodged, the blade slicing a lock of hair from her head. She countered with a wide, desperate swing of her rifle. Wood slammed against steel, sparks flying as the weapons clashed. He was stronger, trained, disciplined. Every movement of his blade was calculated, efficient. He pressed her back step by step, each strike ringing in her bones as she blocked. With her rifle, her arms ached, her knees buckled, and still he came on. But Eliza fought with something he didn't understand. She fought with defiance, with memory, with the fire of every doubt she had ever endured. She swung with Thomas's voice in her head, with the laughter of the soldiers who had mocked her ringing in her ears. She would not give them the satisfaction of her failure. The commander lunged, his blade thrusting straight for her chest. At the last moment, she twisted, catching the sword in the crook of her rifle. The steel bit into the wood, stuck fast in the grain. Before he could wrench it free, she roared and shoved forward, slamming the butt of her rifle into his face. Blood sprayed as his nose broke. He stumbled backward, dazed. Eliza didn't hesitate. She swung again and again, each blow fueled by fury and survival. Wood cracked against armor, against flesh, against bone. The commander tried to parry, but his sword was tangled in the jammed barrel. She pressed harder, driving him back until at last, with a final desperate swing, she struck him square across the temple. He crumpled into the mud. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The battlefield roared on around her, but in that space, in that breath, silence reigned. The enemy commander lay still, his sword fallen from his hand. His men, who had been surging with fury only moments before, faltered. Some froze in disbelief. Others shouted in panic. The anchor had been cut loose, just as Thomas had said. Eliza staggered back, blood dripping from her arm, sweat soaking her face. She could barely breathe, barely stand. Yet she stood nonetheless, her broken rifle clutched in her hands like a banner. She had done the impossible, and the enemy knew it. Their cries shifted from rage to confusion, from determination to fear. Without their commander, their line faltered. Soldiers began to retreat, some breaking rank entirely. The storm they had brought down upon the valley was unraveling before her eyes. Eliza Ward, the woman no one wanted in the regiment, had turned the tide of battle with nothing but a jammed rifle and unbreakable resolve. But even as victory edged closer, she felt her knees weaken, her vision blur. She was wounded, exhausted, and the fight was not yet over. The battle might shift, but it was far from finished. And Eliza Ward would have to find the strength to see it through. The battlefield held its breath in the moment after the commander's fall. His lifeless body sprawled in the mud, his polished sword lying just out of reach, glinting dully in the smoke-filled air. For an instant, it seemed as though the very earth itself was stunned by what had happened. Then the cries began. Commander down. Someone shouted in disbelief. Panic rippled like a shockwave through the enemy lines. Men faltered mid-strike, their swords hovering uselessly in the air, their eyes darting toward the fallen figure. Others stumbled backward, voices cracking as they cursed or prayed under their breath. The iron thread that had bound them together had been cut. Eliza stood in the middle of it all, swaying on her feet. Her chest heaved as though she had run. For miles. Sweat and blood trickled into her eyes, blurring her vision. The broken rifle trembled in her grip. She could feel her own pulse hammering inside her skull. She wanted nothing more than to collapse in the mud beside the commander she had slain. But she couldn't. Not yet. The enemy was wounded, but not dead. And like a wounded beast, it could still lash out with terrible fury. Behind her, voices rose from her own side. At first, they were murmurs, confused, disbelieving. Then they grew louder, more unified. She did it. The commander's down. Press them. Press them now? The regiment surged with new life. Men who had been on the verge of breaking moments ago now roared forward, bayonets gleaming, muskets raised. The fear that had gripped their hearts gave way to something else, hope. And Eliza Ward had lit the spark. Through the blur of her exhaustion, she heard Thomas's voice again. Not the quiet voice of memory, but his real voice, shouting above the chaos. Forward, lads. Don't give them a chance to breathe. She's opened the door now, drive them through it. Eliza turned her head toward the sound, spotting him a short distance away, sword raised high as he led the men into the fray. His eyes flicked toward her for a moment, and though his face was grim with the weight of command, she saw something she had never seen before. Respect. The enemy scrambled to regroup. Officers shouted frantically, trying to re-establish order. Some men held their ground, forming a shaky line, but the cracks were everywhere. Without their leader, their cohesion unraveled like a torn flag in the wind. Still, the fight was far from over. As Eliza staggered back toward her regiment, a group of enemy soldiers broke free from their collapsing line and charged directly at her. Their faces twisted with desperation, not out of loyalty to their fallen commander, but out of fear of what his death meant for them. She was the symbol of their unraveling, and symbols, they knew, had to be destroyed. Her arms trembled as she raised the broken rifle once more. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her wounded arm throbbed with each heartbeat. She doubted she could last another clash. But before they reached her, a volley of musket fire rang out. The enemy soldiers crumpled into the mud, smoke rising from the line of rifles behind her. Her comrades had covered her, their eyes blazing with the fury of men who had just watched one of their own do the impossible. Eliza, fall back. Thomas's voice cut through the smoke. You've done enough. But Eliza shook her head. Her voice was hoarse, ragged, but steady. Not yet. The regiment surged forward, and Eliza with them. She wasn't a soldier in the line anymore, not really. She was something else, something in between. She fought where she could, swung her broken rifle like a hammer when the enemy came too close, but mostly she kept moving, pushing herself through the mud, through the chaos, refusing to collapse. The tide was turning. She could feel it, see it in the way the enemy faltered, in the way her own regiment pressed harder with each step. For the first time that day, the thought of victory didn't feel like a cruel joke. But turning tides were dangerous. A retreating army was unpredictable, and cornered men fought like wolves. As the regiment advanced, the enemy began a desperate counterstrike. Musket fire cracked through the smoke, mowing down men on both sides. Cannon fire roared. From the distant ridge, the earth shaking as iron tore through the field. Eliza stumbled as a blast hurled mud into the air beside her, the shockwave rattling her teeth. She fell to her knees, coughing, ears ringing. Around her, men screamed, some falling, others charging blindly through the haze. Her vision swam. She forced herself back up, staggering forward again, though every step felt heavier than the last. Stay with me, she muttered to herself. Stay with me. Through the chaos, she saw something that chilled her blood. A group of Beven enemy soldiers had regrouped near the fallen commander. They clustered around his body, not to mourn him, but to retrieve something. One man lifted the commander's sword, the gleaming symbol of his authority, and held it high. The sight sparked a flicker of life in the enemy ranks. A cheer rose up, ragged but dangerous. The men, who had been faltering only moments ago, rallied toward the sword. Eliza's stomach clenched. It wasn't the man himself who held their strength. It was what he represented. And if they carried that symbol back into the fight, her hard-won victory could unravel in an instant. She knew what she had to do, even if it killed her. She shoved her way forward, ignoring the cries of her comrades, ignoring Thomas's shouted command to fall back. Her eyes locked on that sword, gleaming in the smoke. She staggered toward it, one hand clutching her wound, the other gripping the broken rifle like a lifeline. The man holding the sword saw her coming. He sneered, lifting it higher, rallying his men with renewed vigor. But Eliza did not slow. With a raw scream, she lunged. Her rifle slammed into his wrist with bone-cracking force. The sword clattered into the mud. She snatched it up before it touched the ground, the weight of it jarring through her weakened arms. The enemy gasped, their cries faltering as they watched a bloodied, mud-soaked woman lift their commander's blade high. For a moment, it was as though time itself stopped. Eliza raised the sword above her head, her voice ripping from her throat in a ragged, defiant roar. "He's gone, and this is ours now." The words tore through the battlefield like cannon. Fire. Her regiment erupted in a roar of their own, surging forward with renewed ferocity. The enemy, faced with the sight of their commander's sword in the hands of their foe, finally broke. Panic surged through their ranks. Men dropped weapons, turned, and fled. The turning tide had become a flood. But victory came at a cost. As the enemy broke and scattered, Eliza swayed on her feet. Her vision blurred into gray, the edges darkening. The sword trembled in her grasp, its weight almost too much to bear. Around her, the regiment pushed onward, driving the enemy into full retreat, but she could no longer follow. Her knees buckled. The mud rushed up to meet her. "Eliza!" Thomas's voice cut through the din as he rushed to her side. He knelt beside her, his hands steadying her shoulders. His face was streaked with grime and blood, but his eyes burned with fierce pride. "You did it," he said, his voice raw. "By God, you did it." Eliza tried to answer, but only a whisper escaped her lips. "Stay with me?" Her grip loosened, and the commander's sword slipped from her hand, clattering into the mud. Darkness pressed at the edges of her vision, and though she fought it with everything she had, exhaustion finally claimed her. When she woke, she was no longer on the battlefield. The roar of musket fire and cannons was gone, replaced by the quiet crackle of a fire and the muted groans of the wounded. She lay on a rough cot in a makeshift field hospital, her arm bound in bandages, her body aching from head to toe. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a fever dream, if the battle, the commander, the sword, had been nothing more than the invention of a half-conscious mind. Then she saw Thomas sitting beside her, his uniform torn, his face lined with exhaustion. He met her eyes, and for the first time since she had joined the regiment, he smiled. "You turned the tide, Eliza," he said softly. "You saved us all." Her throat tightened, tears welling in her eyes. She had set out only to prove that she belonged. But in the heat of battle, she had done far more than that. She had changed the course of the fight. And though scars and doubts still lingered, one truth was undeniable. Eliza Ward was no longer the woman they tried to push aside. She was the soldier who had seized the turning tide with her own two hands. The morning after the battle dawned gray, the sky heavy with low clouds. Smoke from smoldering ruins clung stubbornly to the earth, curling into the air in thin black tendrils. The battlefield, once a storm of gunfire and screams, now lay quiet too quiet. It was the kind of silence that followed only after devastation, the kind that hummed in the bones and pressed upon the heart. Eliza lay still on her cot in the makeshift field hospital, staring at the canvas roof above her. Her arm ached where the bandages wrapped tight around her wound, and every breath rattled in her lungs like gravel. The taste of iron lingered in her mouth, a ghost of blood that no amount of water could wash away. Around her, the moans of the wounded mingled with the whispered prayers of medics tending to the injured. Men groaned in fevered sleep. Some didn't wake at all. She turned her head slowly, wincing at the pain that streaked down her spine. Rows of cots stretched into the distance, each occupied by a body friend or stranger. It no longer mattered. Some stared blankly at the canvas above. Others clutched rosaries in trembling fingers. Others called out for mothers or wives who would never come. Victory, Eliza realized, was not the clean triumph the stories promised. Victory reeked of sweat, blood, and rot. Victory was quieter than she had ever imagined, and far more bitter. Thomas appeared at her side before long, his presence a steady anchor in the shifting tide of despair. His uniform hung in tatters, a long bandage wrapped around his temple, where blood had dried. Yet despite his own wounds, he still carried himself with the weight of command. "You're awake," he said softly, pulling up a stool beside her. His voice was tired but relieved. Eliza tried to smile, but the effort felt foreign, almost painful. "Barely," she rasped, her throat raw. He chuckled dryly, though the sound lacked true mirth. "Barely is better than not at all. I thought we might lose you last night." "You almost did," she admitted, glancing down at her bandaged arm. "If the medics hadn't reached me in time." The silence between them carried the unspoken truth. Many others hadn't been as fortunate. Later that day, when she was strong enough to walk with Thomas's help, he led her beyond the tent. The air outside was heavy with the scent of mud and gunpowder, but fresher than the suffocating atmosphere of the hospital. Eliza leaned on him as they made their way toward a ridge overlooking the battlefield. What she saw stole the breath from her chest. The ground was littered with bodies, friend and foe alike, sprawled in grotesque shapes across the field. Rifles lay abandoned in the mud. Broken cannons jutted out like the bones of some fallen beast. The river that had once sparkled in sunlight now ran dark, tainted by the storm of death that had swept across its banks. Her stomach clenched, and she had to look away. She had braced herself for the sight, but nothing could have truly prepared her. "Is this what we fought for?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas didn't answer at once. His jaw tightened as he stared at the devastation. Finally, he said, "We fought so it wouldn't be worse. But the truth is, war never leaves anything clean. You fight, you bleed, and you pray the sacrifice means something." Eliza's throat tightened. She had slain the enemy commander, turned the tide, carried his sword for all to see. Men now whispered her name with reverence, even awe. But standing on that ridge, gazing down at the shattered lives, she felt no triumph, only weight. In the days that followed, Eliza became something she had never intended, a symbol. Whenever she limped through camp, soldiers stopped to stare. Some whispered in admiration. Others saluted, their eyes burning with respect she had never known before. There were even those who dared to approach her, asking for her story, begging to touch the sword she had taken from the enemy commander. It unsettled her. She had fought because she had no choice, because survival demanded it, because her regiment had needed something to believe in when all seemed lost. But to them, she was not just a comrade anymore, she was a legend. One evening, as she sat near the fire, a young soldier with barely a trace of beard on his chin approached. He clutched his cap in trembling hands, his voice uncertain. "Miss Ward," he stammered. I wanted to say, when the commander fell, when you raised his sword, I swear it was like God himself was with us. You saved us all." Eliza shifted uncomfortably under his wide-eyed gaze. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she had been terrified, that her arms had nearly given out, that she had been one heartbeat away from collapse the entire time. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she forced a nod. "I only did what I had to do." The boy smiled, as if her modesty only proved her greatness. He saluted awkwardly before scurrying away. Thomas, seated across from her, raised an eyebrow. "You'd better get used to it. Stories spread faster than musket fire, and yours will travel far. You're not just Eliza Ward anymore. You're the woman who broke the enemy's spine." Eliza stared into the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. She had wanted recognition, yes, but not like this, not at the cost of so many lives. As night fell, sleep brought no peace. Dreams dragged her back to the battlefield again and again. She saw the enemy commander's eyes in his final moments, wide with disbelief. She felt the weight of his sword, heavier than any steel had a right to. She heard the cries of men as they fell, their blood splattering the earth. Each time she jolted awake, her breath came ragged, her hands trembling. She pressed her palms against her face, whispering to herself, "Stay with me, stay with me," as though she could ward off the ghosts that clung to her. But the ghosts remained. Days turned into a week, and the regiment prepared to move on. The enemy had retreated far enough to give them breathing room, but everyone knew it was temporary. War had not ended with the fall of one commander. War never ended so easily. On the morning of departure, Thomas handed her the sword she had taken. Its blade had been cleaned, its hilt polished, yet it still gleamed the weight of memory. "It's yours now," he said simply. Eliza hesitated, staring at the weapon. She had no desire to carry it. Every time she looked at it, she saw not victory, but the man who had wielded it before her. But she also knew she couldn't leave it behind. Symbols mattered, whether she wanted them to or not. She took the sword, her grip firm despite the shiver that ran through her. "Then I'll carry it," she said softly, "but I'll never forget what it cost." Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. That's the kind of soldier the world needs." As they marched onward, the men rallied behind her presence. Their eyes lit with renewed determination whenever they saw her at the front, the commander's sword at her side. They whispered her name like a promise, Eliza Ward, the woman who had turned the tide. But inside, Eliza carried the truth. Glory was a crown of thorns, and victory was etched in scars. She had proven herself beyond question, but she also bore the weight of every life lost on that field. And though she walked with her head high, though she met the gaze of every man who looked to her for strength, she knew the real battle was no longer against the enemy beyond the ridge. The real battle was within her, against the memories, the guilt, the endless question of whether the blood spilled had been worth the ground gained. That was the true price of glory. The war did not end with one victory, nor even with the fall of a single commander. It dragged on, stretching its shadow across the land like a storm that refused to break. Armies clashed, villages burned, and rivers of blood carved themselves into the soil of a young nation still trying to define itself. Yet within the chaos, certain names rose above the rest, names carried in whispers across campfires, in hurried letters sent to loved ones, in the solemn prayers of those who feared they would not see another dawn. One of those names was Eliza Ward. Months had passed since the day she had been handed the jammed rifle, since she had turned the weapon of failure into an act of defiance that ended with an enemy commander lying dead at her feet. What began as a desperate fight for survival had grown into a story that refused to die. Everywhere the regiment marched, soldiers spoke of her deeds. New recruits who had never seen her fight still treated her as though she carried the strength of 100 men. Even civilians, their faces weary with fear and hunger, found hope in her presence. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts to catch a glimpse of her when the column passed through town. Women pressed small tokens into her hand scraps of ribbon, stitched crosses, fragments of family keepsakes saying, "Carry this, Miss Ward, for luck. Carry it so you'll come home." At first, the attention made her skin crawl. She was no saint, no savior. She was a woman who had done what she had to do in the heat of battle, nothing more. But as the weeks turned into months, she began to understand the people needed symbols. In a war that stripped everything else away, they needed something. Someone to believe in. If that burden had fallen on her shoulders, she could not set it down. Thomas remained by her side, his steady presence grounding her through the weight of expectation. He often joked that she should grow used to the stares, that soon enough the stories would outpace reality. "By the time this is done," he said. One evening, as they shared a tin of coffee by the fire, "they'll be saying you wrestled the commander barehanded and snapped his sword over your knee." Eliza smirked tiredly. "And you'll be the one to spread that tale, won't you?" "Perhaps," he said with a wink, "but only because legends inspire. Sometimes the truth alone doesn't carry far enough." His words lingered with her. What was the value of truth in war? Did it matter if men believed she was braver than she felt, stronger than she was? If it gave them courage to face the next dawn? Perhaps stories were as much a weapon as any rifle or blade. Still, even legends bled. The battles that followed tested her body and spirit. Each clash left her more scarred, each march more weary. The wound in her arm healed into a jagged reminder of that fateful day. But the deeper wounds, the ones carved into her mind, never faded. At night, she still dreamed of the commander's eyes. By day, she saw too many more fall, both friends and enemies, each face branded into her memory. Yet she carried on, because to falter would mean betraying those who looked to her, and worse, those who had already given their lives. The turning point came during a brutal winter campaign. The regiment, worn thin and starving, faced a siege that threatened to break them entirely. Supplies were scarce, morale was lower than the temperature, and even Thomas's voice no longer carried the same fire. It was then that Eliza rose again, not with the flash of steel this time, but with the strength of presence. She moved from fire to fire, speaking to men on the verge of desertion, sharing her own rations with boys too weak to lift their rifles, reminding them of what they fought for, not just land or pride, but each other. When the enemy finally struck, the regiment held their ground with a ferocity no one had expected from soldiers so weary. Later, Thomas would say it had been Eliza who kept them standing, Eliza who gave them the will to resist. That winter, her legend was no longer just about a single battle. It was about endurance, about the human spirit refusing to break, even when the body cried for surrender. When the war at last drew to its ragged close, the world had changed. Fields were scarred, towns burned, families shattered. But from the sea, ashes, a new chapter of the United States was beginning to write itself. Eliza Ward returned home, though home no longer looked the same. Her parents were older, their hair grayer, their eyes filled with relief and sorrow in equal measure. Friends from her youth were gone, claimed by battle or by grief. The town whispered her name both in awe and unease, as though unsure how to speak to someone who had lived as both woman and warrior. For weeks, she struggled with the return to ordinary life. The clatter of plates at supper felt too loud after years of musket fire. The sight of children playing in the fields filled her with joy and sorrow in equal measure, for she thought of those who would never see their own children again. But slowly, painfully, she learned to live again. She helped rebuild the town, taught younger girls to read and write, offered her hands to neighbors in need. And always, she carried the sword not as a weapon now, but as a relic, a reminder of the cost of survival. Years passed, and the story of Eliza Ward only grew. Newspapers retold her exploits with flourishes of drama. Veterans, their memories fading, embellished her deeds until she seemed larger than life. Songs were sung, ballads written. To many, she became less a woman and more a myth. But those who had fought beside her knew the truth. They remembered her not just as the woman who had slain an enemy commander, but as the comrade who had sat beside them at the fire, who had carried water for the wounded, who had shared her bread when none remained. For them, Eliza Ward was not just a legend, she was family. On a quiet evening many years later, Eliza sat on her porch as the sun sank low over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Her hair had turned silver, her face lined with age, but her eyes still carried the fire of battles long past. Thomas, older now too, visited often. The two shared long silences, comfortable in the bond forged through years of war and survival. That night, he broke the quiet with a question. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice low. "The fighting, the killing, the weight of it all?" Eliza thought for a long while before answering. "I regret the lives lost," she said finally. "I regret that war demanded so much from so many. But I do not regret standing when I was called to. I do not regret refusing to break. If my story gave others the strength to endure, then it was worth the scars." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the fading sun. "Then the world will remember you rightly." Eliza smiled faintly. "Let them remember the truth or the legend. In the end, it makes no difference. What matters is that they remember the cost." When she passed away years later, the nation mourned her as a hero. Veterans marched in her honor, newspapers printed her portrait, and children learned her name in their lessons. Yet among the stories and songs, the truest legacy was carried. In the quiet moments, in the soldier who remembered her kindness, in the family who lived because she had fought, in the towns rebuilt by those who drew courage from her example. Eliza Ward's life had been forged in fire, her legacy tempered by loss and sacrifice. She had been handed a broken rifle, thrust into a moment where failure seemed certain, and instead she had carved a path through history. Not because she sought glory, not because she desired to be remembered, but because, in the darkest moment, she had chosen to fight. And that choice, simple and terrible, echoed through generations.